Hey folks, I'm Bill Kaufman. I'm going to just be your host and try to fill in where necessary. I'm from Internet2 and InCommon. And welcome to presentation from the National Institutes of Health on how they're changing access through adding multi-factor authentication. Today we have with us, and these are all from the National Institutes of Health, Jeff Erickson, who is Chief of Identity, Credential and Access Management Services. Sandeep Sathya Prasad, I hope I got that right, Project Delivery Manager, and also Sumit Nanda, a technical lead working on identity and access management. Jeff, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. So first, let me just make sure that you're seeing my slide. It should be the title slide, October 5th, 2021, Updated Identity Management Requirements.
We are.
Excellent. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us, and thanks for the introduction. So for some of you may remember last year, we presented, I think, and announced what I'll be talking about here in a little bit, giving you an update about the first phase of some changes that we're making. And so today I'll be giving an update on that and talking about the progress we've made and what comes next. So if I can drive this. There we go. So the agenda, first I'll start with why are we doing this, and then talk a little bit about what we've done and here in phase one. And we have a recorded demo of how of the user experience. And then I think the most time will be spent today talking about phase two, which is what's started now and will be running through the end of 2022. And all of that is in support of researcher access. And then we'll talk about some of the different things that we're honoring here with respect to different REFEDS standards. Specifically, the one that will be the focus of phase two is the REFED of assurance framework, some recommended next steps. And then we've got a slide at the end that has a whole bunch of hyperlinks in it for access to additional data sources or information sources. And this needn't take the full 40 minutes. I'm anticipating that it won't. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions that you might have along the way, or at the end rather. So in case you don't know, the National Institutes of Health is a federal agency within the Department of Health and Human Services, and our mission is to perform medical research, to train future researchers, and I won't read our mission statement, but there it is. What we've been focusing on with my team, and I will put in a plug that we could not have done anything that we've pulled off without help from the InCommon team, Anne and Tom and Albert, among many others, as well as folks from research institutions around the country who have used the compliance check tool that we built, as well as another group here at the NIH who run the electronic research administration system that manages all of our grants. It truly was a collaborative effort. The main focus has been around making sure that when people are logging into NIH systems, that we get a standard set of basic information about people who are logging in, that people do multi-factor authentication when they log in, and that we have some indication about the assurance that the identity provider has, the research institution has, about who that person is. So separating out 2 and 3 is 2 being how did they log in, the multi-factor piece, and number 3 is about who is actually logging in. So those were our three main things that we were focused on: the basic information, the MFA, and the identity assurance. So, as I said, over the course of the past year, since last November, and what we just turned on September 15th, a couple weeks ago, was a process where we send a signal to the IDP that the user selects. The IDP needs to be able to interpret the signal that we send them, and then prepare the package that we need to send us the response. That package including that basic set of information that I mentioned, as well as the IDP performing MFA on our behalf. If all of that happens and they've constructed the response, the assertions according to the standard format that we've adopted, then they can have access. In the September 15th timeframe was to the ERA system that we have here. There is, as noted there at the bottom, there is a backdoor that in the event that an institution doesn't yet support this capability, that's okay. We certainly don't want to disenfranchise anybody, and researchers can still log into ERA using their ERA credentials that they have, which is a local username and password. Or they can log in using a credential that they get from the General Services Administration login.gov service. I don't remember if I put it on this slide. One thing to know is that ERA is moving to require multi-factor authentication for all of their users over time. They did push out the date. I'm not exactly sure what the new date is, but they are moving in that direction. So over time, that option for the ERA username and password will likely be deprecated, in which case, if people aren't using this federated multi-factor mechanism that we just turned on, then their only other option is going to be to go to login.gov. And that goes back to another reason why we undertook this project with everyone, is that it just seemed like people have, to the extent that all of you, the IDPs around the world, you know who your staff are, you run these services, you already presumably do some level of MFA. If we can leverage that, then that's win-win for everybody. It's good for us because we don't need to send somebody to another credential provider to get yet another credential. It's good for us from the standpoint that the MFA, the credentials that they manage and use every day for accessing your systems, they're able to use to get to NIH systems. And it's fundamentally, it's good for the researcher who then, again, doesn't have to manage multiple credentials. They can use the credential and the MFA that they use every day to access NIH resources. So the way that this thing works, and I've got a description here, and then I'm going to just play a video that shows this. So it starts with one of your researchers, or our researchers, our shared researchers, logging into the ERA system. We, in the demo that you're going to see, we're using University of Wisconsin. That person selects their organization from the list of institutions. Behind the scenes, we send a signal out to that IDP. That IDP performs the MFA, packages up the assertions that they send back to us that includes that basic set of information that I described, the MFA assertion and some assertion of identity assurance, and they're in. So that's the process that, let's see if I can make this video work. Click here. So this, by the way, is in the ERA development environment. So in the URL, you see the stage reference. This isn't the production instance of ERA, but you'll see the selection of University of Wisconsin-Madison there in the where you from list, the redirect out to Wisconsin, log in now somewhere on a pre-registered device that has Duo on it. He does the push notification. Wisconsin packages up the assertion, sends it back to us, and the next screen is he's in to ERA. That's it. So when it works well, that's the process. That just got turned on September. It did it over the night on the 15th, but people started using it starting on the 16th. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any data prior to this about how many times it's been used. One data point that I do have is that on the way into the turning this on, before we turned it on, ERA in their drop-down list, they used to manually maintain that drop-down list because they didn't allow federated access for just any institution. There was a whole process that IDPs had to go through. And there were, I think the number was about 96 research institutions who had gone through that process. The ERA tells me that it actually wasn't used very much. Most people would log in using their ERA credentials instead of that federated option. But there were 96 institutions in the list. Now that once we turned this on, it's a list of about, what is it, 3,000, 3,200, something like that. It really is the entire in-common federation and the interfederation partners that we've got. Of course, not all of those are compliant with the ability to receive the signal that we're sending. So we don't govern the list as a function of these are the ones that will do the multi-factor authentication that we need. We just display the full list. In the event that somebody selected an institution that doesn't yet support this, then we throw an error that says that displays here's who to contact at your IDP if you selected. I think UCLA actually does support this, but I'm going to pick on them because I saw those initials a minute ago. If they selected UCLA and UCLA did not support this this standard, then they would see an error message saying you can contact so-and-so at UCLA. Because it could be too that UCLA does support the signaling standard, but that individual isn't enabled for MFA at UCLA. That's another error use case. And we also display the message that if you want, you can still come, if you're in a hurry or if you want, you can still come back and log into ERA with your ERA username and password that you'd used previously. So that was it for phase one. That just got turned on. So with the enablement or the rollout of phase one, we have turned our attention to phase two. And I will give a shout out and props to Brett Bieber. We stole his slides that he had presented a couple, thank you, a couple months ago, where he had presented this message, which talks about some of what institutions will need to do over the coming year in order to align with what we're trying to do with respect to identity assurance. And fundamentally, it comes down to linking processes that an institution is already following to your IDP that we, the NIH service provider, are interfacing with. So that place that we're sending our signal and that is responding, doing the MFA and responding to us as often as not, as many of you probably know, that IDP may not know and may not be connected to other processes. So for example, you've got staff or students who might be working in a research lab who come to the university and go through some sort of in-person or remote ID proofing process. And depending on which one they did, they might, whether they were present and showed their I-9 documents or they did it in some remote fashion, ultimately it's tying that government issued ID that the person has to show their identity to some onboarding process. So that somehow needs to be tied in with other sources that exist at the university in the event of, it could be your HR database that has other name information. You could be tying against the doing the verify lookup. Perhaps you've got a connection out to a system that actually validates the information that's on an I-9 document, tying that into other IAM systems that you're running on your way to the systems that we are actually going to interface with, so that in the end, when we send our signal, you actually are able, you have information that fundamentally in the future we'll be looking for, that represents the strength of the assurance, identity assurance that you have of that person who's logging in. So the MFA that's like now table stakes. This next part is the piece where we want to make sure that you know with some higher level of assurance that who the person is. In other words, it's linking that account create request in your directory and the linkage to MFA that you do back to some process that already exists at the institution. So this is another version of the a spectrum slide that Brett had prepared that shows that there is not one way to assert identity assurance. There are many. So the ReFed's assurance framework has its way of doing it. In the government, we follow the National Institute of Standard and Technologies 863-3 standard, which talks about identity assurance levels 1, 2, and 3. Kantara has its, etc. And they don't all line up, and they don't all necessarily mean exactly the same thing. So one thing we as a community have in front of us over the course of the next year is, given that there is not one thing that all of these things agree on that says, if you do this, then it means that. It's part of what we're trying to get to is an agreement on what are the processes that can reflect a level of identity assurance that a federal system or set of systems like NIH runs, that is the minimum for accessing information that we have. And I will point to this one here. I don't know if my cursor is moving. Nope, I don't see it. The IAL2 one in the NIST 863 column. That one really is going to be the most common one that I think you'll see federal agencies look for, because what that represents is some identity assurance. It doesn't have to be actually the in-person identity assurance, but there is some level of identity assurance that the IDP has and is able to assert. And most of the systems that we run are not top secret. They're not national security like systems. Those are the ones that need that higher level of identity assurance, the IAL3, which includes that the minimum for that is the in-person ID proofing. So I think what you're going to see is this IAL2 level, which in the yellow that's reflected here, high confidence in the asserted identity's accuracy. That's part of what we need to try and collectively figure out. What have you in the Federation, our Federation partners done within your onboarding processes, your ID proofing processes, that you're able to link something that allows you as an IDP, in response to the signal that we send, to assert with high confidence the accuracy of the identity that you are asserting, so that we can grant access to systems here at the NIH that are could apply to other federal agencies as well, because we all have this 863 standard that we're trying to align to. That's where we're trying to fit. So I'm almost done with slides, and then we can talk. So the last piece then about becoming phase 2 compliant, and I blew past it there when I introduced this, but it's repeated again here by December 2022, and this is a made up date. What we're trying to do is give you time to adjust processes, but also buy ourselves some time. It does require on behalf of NIH that different NIH systems have to do some risk acceptance and file some documentation with the various authorizing officials that we have that for the different systems that we run, where we say, eyes wide open, understanding the risk that for the next year, we will allow these federated authentications to come in where the identity assurance that's being asserted might not be at this IAL2 level that the security categorization of the system demands. But we recognize that the benefits, if you will, of this federated access, including the MFA that comes with it, that fills a niche, fills a gap, and that the MFA piece can in some respects be considered a compensating control, and over and above, well, what's the alternative? Somebody using a Google account, for example, where we've done no identity proofing, it's effectively an anonymous account, and there's no MFA that we're doing with it. So anyway, the first 2 pieces that are in this are done. This was what we just did in phase 1. The IDPs accept the NIH signal and turn around and send us back the MFA, do the MFA and send us back the MFA assertion. So it's really this green box that represents the focus of this next phase. And so consider it what is that, a year and a couple months to try and get there. We have built, similar to what we did for, I also blew past this, there was a hyperlink on one of the previous slides that represented an ERA compliance check. That didn't actually include this identity assurance piece. So there is a tool that we've built that allows you as an IDP owner to confirm when you come to the site and you select your institution, number 1, can you receive and interpret the signal that we send? And number 2, when you do your MFA and send us the response, are you sending the basic information that we're looking for, the MFA assertion, and in this case, the identity assurance or the identity assertion that we are looking for and need. So that represents a tool that we've built for folks to leverage to get compliant. Again, over time, at this note here at the bottom that the systems here at the NIH and across other agencies are moving, we're at different paces, we're implementing these requirements that, well, I have to do MFA and I need this IAL2 identity assurance. And the login.gov is has arisen as this credential of last resort for some systems, that if those federated partners aren't able to fulfill the need, well, I got to do it. So I'm going to send people over to GSA and make the different folks get a login.gov credential. So that's kind of the fallback in the event that IDPs aren't able to accommodate this. And the last slide I have then is links to a whole bunch of information. So over on the reading right to left, we've got a bunch of NIH websites that talk about different things that we've done in relative to announcements that we've made and authentications that we've done. Back over on the left, this wiki was one that Albert Wu, I think, wrote in its entirety practically. It's got a ton of great information for all of you for how to, what we're doing and when and how to become compliant. The ones in the middle, you've probably, many of you on the call probably had a hand in writing some of those. One I will point to is this InCommon Assured Access Working Group, which is a group that's been meeting for a couple months now, perhaps as much as the last year, as well as the MFA group. I think this Assured Access group, though, is trying to sort out what some of those standards are that you as research institutions can do to tie your existing onboarding processes to your IDP so that you can assert these identities, the identity assurance that we're looking for. And there was one thing that I wanted to remember to say, and I forgot, but it might come to me in the question time. So that's it for slides. Open discussion, any questions? And here I'll reintroduce my colleague Sumit Ananda, who's our technical lead. Sandeep had a family thing. He was going to be late. I'm not sure if he's going to be on or not, but hopefully he's been able to join and can chime in if need be. But any questions? And I see there's some in the chat, it looks like.
I think so far those are just some informative links that Brett and
Yep.
Albert were adding.
Let's see, E-Verify and I-9 map to low assurance, but NIH will require high assurance. Right, so if you, I'll make an allegation here, and Sumit and those of you who've read it, Tom I think has, Chris might have, can keep me honest. IAL2 implies remote identity proofing has been done. So it doesn't require that in-person identity proofing has been done. So if you will, from our perspective, that middle identity assurance level, the IAL2 one is the one that says that the data that somebody has, if you're doing it remotely, the data that they've typed into your web form, you've thrown it against Experian or some other authoritative source to validate that at some level of likelihood, only that person would know that information as collected and validated.
Hey, sir.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Kyle Lewis. I'm actually working down within NIAID. I'm the source of the spectrum slide, but if I can help you out with that question, because I had to do the analysis on that.
Oh, cool. Thank you, Kyle.
Yes, sir. So the question from Jim Basney was the difference between E-Verify and I-9 mapping to low assurance. And the reason for that is if you look at the documents required for E-Verify and I-9 of what is required to be accepted, there is at least one combination of documents that does not require a photo ID. So from a risk acceptance perspective, from the service provider's perspective, you cannot guarantee if all someone's done is that they would achieve a higher IAP level. As far as IAL2, Mr. Erickson's exactly correct. It's based on the data that's stored in that system. And we had to go through the same process for our system because we have an IAL2 level requirement. And we had to pitch to our own authorizing official in NIAID, Mr. Tartakovsky, of why we should accept IAP high as the equivalent of IAL2. The IAP medium and low didn't quite meet the threshold. If anyone's interested in more on that story, I've pitched for an ACAMP session to walk through that spectrum process later in this week. Thank you.
So Kyle, you might actually be able to help answer this next question. No plans for RAF high. So the way that this chart presents this, RAF high maps to IAL2, which implies that, says that we do have plans for RAF high. That's exactly what our target will be. That there isn't currently in the REFEDS Assurance Framework 1.0, there isn't an RAF IAP very high, something above that, right? That maps to our IAL3, which implies the in-person ID proofing.
Yes, sir. That's correct. One of the curveballs that we ran into when we did the analysis is, a lot of these systems were 3-tiered systems, a low, medium, and high in each system, but not every medium mapped to medium. As you can see, even on the IDAS, the European standards, RAF high maps to the middle of the European standards, and you never actually get up to IDAS high. So to get back to what you said, sir, it all depends on the data that's in the system. And since we're mostly talking about research systems, many of those will require IAL2, which would map to IAP high.
Yep. And to try and answer Martin's question about PubMed. So PubMed, just as this chart shows a spectrum of identity assurance levels, I'm sure all of you also have systems that form a spectrum, a range of risk, right? Some are open access, some at the other end are absolutely not open access, right? So that this whole discussion about identity assurance and higher levels of identity assurance, higher levels of authentication assurance, the MFA piece, those really are at that end of the spectrum where that the risk is higher and that higher identity assurance and authentication assurance exists. PubMed is at, I'll call the lower end of the spectrum. PubMed is public information. The login for PubMed in many respects is for convenience. It isn't as a security tool. You don't have to have an account to be able to go to PubMed and do searches. The reason that people have accounts as often as not is so that they're in their PubMed profile, they're able to save searches or things that they come back and do time and again. So for example, of me here on my home computer, if I were to go and try and log into PubMed, one day I might want to search for one thing. I'm not a researcher. I'm going to come back the next day and I'm wondering what I can find about this. But as often as not, the researchers who are using PubMed, they're coming back time and time and time again, looking for what's the latest, what are the latest publications in my field, in my space. And that's where that profile really, really serves. So in fact, PubMed's requirement for identity assurance is IAL1. They actually don't have a requirement that they know who you are. They don't even have a requirement for MFA, right? So part of what the service that we run here at the NIH does is we are something of a proxy where there are myriad systems, or many hundreds of systems that we front and provide single sign-on among those systems. Some of them are like PubMed. We front PubMed. It has this IAL1. There's a corresponding AAL1 for the authentication assurance level, which reflects username and password. So that's on one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum might be controlled access research data sets, which are at the IAL2, AAL2, or the highway end of the spectrum. And ERA actually is in the middle. ERA wants MFA, so they're at the AAL2, the authentication assurance level 2 represents MFA. But for ERA, they're also an IAL1 identity assurance level. So part of what we do is that you can think of, you've heard of step-up authentication. Well, imagine step-up identity, where as you transit among these various systems which have these different requirements, you may have started by logging into PubMed, and in which case, whatever got you in. I mean, you could have provided a username and password from what we ask the institution to do in that case could be RAF IAP low and username and password is fine, come on in. But if that person then immediately tries to jump over to some controlled access data set, not only do we need to do step-up authentication and have that person do MFA, but we also need the IDP, or will need in the future, we'll need the IDP to increase their claim of the identity assurance of the individual. So hopefully that answers that question. So where does local enterprise assurance fit? Can I defer to, yeah, thank you, Martin. Can I defer to somebody who's been on that working group and talking about this stuff? Because I know that they've been debating where local enterprise fits in. I'll let somebody else talk before I have something I'd throw in, but
yeah, I can add in some of the recommendations that we've decided to come up with in terms of the order of implementation for institutions. Local enterprise is not represented on this spectrum diagram because it doesn't directly align with these various levels. There's no way to kind of equate what my local enterprise and my how confident I have and trustworthiness of those identities to access my own internal critical systems. That can vary between various institutions, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. So I think an easy step forward for folks is to begin understanding where identity proofing occurs within your organizations, understand both the proofing aspect of that, as well as your credential binding. So how the identity is actually bound to the credential, and just begin to understand where that happens within your organization. And the recommendations that we've put forth from the Assured Access Working Group was to focus first on local enterprise, because your institution obviously already understands the security and accepts the risk of those internal identities to access your own internal systems, such as your the system where you would log in, an employee would log in to direct where their paycheck is dispersed. You already accept the risk of that. So that should be, that's basically an example of what local enterprise would mean for an identity that is within your own institution. So the recommendation was to explore local enterprise first, because you could easily obtain that level and assert that claim level for a large user base at your institution. In addition, if you proof them and you handle the credentials in the same way for that one person that is accessing those internal critical systems, and you follow all those same processes for very large roles within your institution, you could easily encompass all of your active students or active employees with that local enterprise level. And then we recommended moving on to what we see here within the assurance spectrum of low, then medium, and then high, and working to pursue those. The document that we have that I think Albert provided a link to, the DOI for that, contains a lot more in-depth information around what local enterprise can mean to you. And I think we're still interested in figuring out how service providers would see the value of that. I think there's a lot of value in it. And I don't know if there's others here that want to weigh in on the local enterprise. So far, we don't know that we've got many service providers that are specifically asking for it, but I think there's a lot of value in it. And I would like to see more service providers taking the same steps as the NIH to actually begin asking for identity assurance and looking at it from both what value could local enterprise bring you, and also what value do these higher levels get you?
If I could piggyback on what Brett was saying there, that for us, we view local enterprise as a step in climbing or a rung in the ladder. For us, it's like a risk mitigation tactic, if you will, that while understanding that it will take time to tie, for many of you, maybe you've already done it for all I know, but for other institutions, it may take time for you to tie that ID proofing process to your credential. Local enterprise, as Brett said, could be something trivial to say, oh yeah, well, I see that these things only exist, or this grouper authorization, for example, represents that I know who those people are. All of those people, I'm going to assign them the local enterprise attribute because I know that we vetted them enough. We, for my institution, have accepted a risk of what it is that I'm giving them access to. For us, that is a step above. You have no idea who they are. It doesn't get all the way to, I know exactly who they are, or I've got a higher assurance of who they are, but it's a step forward. And to the extent that it fits into this larger set of capabilities that we're talking about leveraging here, it's the same channel. And this was the thing I was going to say that I forgot to say, is that from our side, you never say you're done, but for all intents and purposes, we're done. We've put in place what we were going to put in place on September 15th. That thing that signals something, that for all intents and purposes, that's done. If you can accept that signal, then we're not gonna, in June next year, we're not gonna come back and say, okay, now we have to signal something different. And the same goes with what it is that you're sending back. In other words, over time, on your own schedules, if you can, as you both first start with what it is that we're signaling now with the ERA compliance checker and say, yeah, that works, I'm good there. And then as you do that work of I think it was, oops, this stuff of tying all of these things together, it's the same channel. And that goes to that other, the NIH compliance checker that will be your indication that you're done, right? And then all we're doing come the end of 2022 is the messaging starts to be that if you don't do this by this time, then you're welcome to go get a login.gov credential, right? But over the course of the next year, you can come online anytime in that period And we at on our team who built the compliance checker, we're here to work with you because we want to. This is good for us too. We want you to be successful because your success is our success. And at the end of the day, going back to that mission statement that I started with, we're about research, and the researchers work in your institutions. Those are the people we're trying to facilitate access for according to these standards that we are obliged to comply with. So I think there are many wins to be had, and we're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with you on being successful here. And I don't know if we go right up to 2 or if there's a hard stop, Bill. If I just noticed my clock says it's 1:46.
Yeah, we can go right to 2 o'clock.
Okay. I don't want to, I'm not going to pull the plug. Where?
Jeff, could I ask a question
Of course.
about, in many ways, in my mind, I see the service that you've built as providing a menu of security options to the backend systems or services that are many within the National Institutes of Health. Do you have any of those specifically that are interested in some of these specific levels of the assurance framework?
So I can offer one that is like on the cusp, or that will be at that higher level. We call it the Researcher Auth, AUTH service, RAS. And it's really, in some respects, it's a bolt-on to the NIH login service that we run that gives access to PubMed and ERA, among many other systems. But RAS, in many respects, fronts controlled access research data that is hosted by a number of different consortia that have gathered the research data that was collected over the course of a series of grants, for example. And so there are petabytes and petabytes, for example, of genomic sequences that might be about people with lung cancer, just for example. And then researchers for another grant, they might say, my research is to analyze that data that you guys are storing, hosting over in this place. And they file their research brief with an access committee that reviews what it is that they say they're going to do, gives them approval and says, yes, you are authorized to access these studies, right? And so I don't know if, I just saw her name in the paper again the other day, a woman named Henrietta Lacks. If you are familiar with her or Google that name, there was that's in the back of people's minds here at the NIH of wanting to make sure that those data, those genomic sequences belong to people. And those people signed a consent form that said, you can use my sequence for this and not that. And so NIH is very, very risk averse when it comes to exposing that sequential information to people who are not authorized. And that's why with RAS as the front end to do the authentications and package up the authorizations that allow people to connect to and do and access those genomic sequences, that we want to know not only that the person did MFA, but we want to know who that, we need that higher level of identity assurance that whoever it is, whether it was login.gov and their process for ID proofing, or your institutions, that we know that you know who that person is, so that we can evaluate that claim and say, this meets the minimum bar needed to connect to that genomic sequence. So RAS is actually one that is, I mean, out of the gate, for all intents and purposes, you should not have access to RAS unless you are at IAL2 and AAL2. That's the type of data that is hosted or that it's fronting, right? But rather than tell 300,000 plus researchers to all go to login.gov and get login.gov credentials, the RAS may be a case in point for local enterprise, right? That at least to start, that the committee, the security committee that evaluates the systems that are granting access to RAS might say, well, yeah, let's allow federated authentication, but only if we're getting the local enterprise claim and only if we're also getting the MFA. So the MFA piece we've done, we've solved that. So it would be really that local enterprises. And I'm not saying this decision has been made yet, it hasn't, but that's the sort of thing, at least could facilitate access. Again, we're in the business of promoting research. It could facilitate access while the rest of these, the construction of the other processes to get to these higher level identity assurances are being built, with the understanding that a day is coming when somebody will say that the only way to get into RAS is if the authentication assurance is at level 2, that is MFA, and if the identity assurance is at a minimum of level 2. And whether that comes from you as our federated IDP partners, or we send somebody to login.gov, one way or the other, that will be the only way to get in. And so that's one example that is like real and present. They are chomping at the bit for this sort of access. Did that answer the question, Brett? I hope.
Yeah, it did. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Well, let's see. Well, I still have the floor and a second. I do want to repeat and say again, my sincere and profound thanks to Albert and Tom in particular. I mean, no joke, we could not have done this without their help. And Anne's contributions as well. There were a number of people in the InCommon team, but seriously, this was it truly was a collaborative effort, and it's one of those things that makes you proud to be a member of an organization like this, and we are. So thank you and to all of you, but thanks specifically to Albert and Tom. They were great.
Well, thank you, Jeff. That was a great presentation, a great discussion, and I think it really helped everybody's understanding of what and why is happening there.
Yeah, thank you all.